Thank you very much, Colette, for coming to Coventry Station Society today. We screened the South Korean film Shadows in the Palace today on your recommendation. What made you choose this film for the society to screen?
I think I wanted to choose something that was less predictable, that in a sense a ghost story with a vengeful virgin ghost would have been a bit predictable. And I think the other thing about it is that it's a film by a female director, and I think it's quite important is to promote the work of female directors, because I don't think that they get enough sort of promotion. And it's just a beautiful film. It's very well acted. It's the music and the costumes, and I actually thought that it would be an enjoyable film to watch for the society.
You mentioned earlier that it could be considered as a feminist film. Do you think that the term feminism and film makes it more marginalised?
It can do. I think there's a sense where you say to someone it's feminist film when all the men run for the door. There's always that problem about it. But I think that that not all films by female directors are feminist. I mean, you've got the case of Catherine Bigelow that's always talked about. But I do think that in dealing with a silent era of women's life in Korea, that it's very much a film with a feminist agenda. Now, whether that's why it was not so successful is I think, something quite interesting, because there's another historical drama that comes out a bit before it called Black Rain, which was a lot more successful, and I don't really know why this wasn't as successful, but I do think that, you know, there are films by female directors that deal with feminist issues.
Do you feel that as a female scholar, you're judged more critically within the academic field?
Oh yes, certainly, and especially when you're talking about horror film, and especially when you might be looking at extreme cinema. That you get quite a lot of criticism. I think it's more difficult. I think it's more difficult in academia generally without being a woman. And then being a woman and not talking about romantic comedies, I think it's difficult because you're not dealing with what is a female genre. And the criticism is that you're promoting a genre that victimises women and positions, you know, sadistic men, and therefore you shouldn't really be promoting the genre. So I think it's quite difficult.
Your book, An Introduction to Japanese Horror Film, highlights most aspects from like the birth of Japanese horror film to all of its subgenres. Will your next book on Korean horror follow the same kind of structure?
Yes, it's more difficult getting hold of the earlier films because of the situation in Korea, but the Korean Archive has been doing quite a lot of restoration work. So it's starting in the 1960s with the work of Mi-jung and his sort of psychological dramas. It's quite difficult to get films from the 70s and 80s, but it's planned to do a sort of as much a historical overview, so it's not too much weighted in terms of contemporary cinema, although more of it will be on the contemporary genres.
When can we expect your next book on Korean cinema to be out?
It's October next year.
Why do you think East Asian cinema, in particular Japanese cinema, is being remade by American studios? And what's your opinion of these remakes?
I think there's a long history of of remaking French films in Hollywood. So it's not just suddenly in terms of Japanese film, there is a history of doing that. I think the Japanese horror films were very popular. And very popular amongst the demographic, which is young 15 to 25, I think, year old demographic. that goes to see these films at the box office. So I think that was the reason for doing it. Not many of them being very successful. I think only The Ring and The Grudge have been successful. None of the others have done particularly well at all. I think Verbinski's The Ring, I think there's nothing wrong with it. I think if you're going to take something, you need to do something different with it. And I think he does something. The basic idea you can find in other horror films, but I think he does something different with it. And I think it works on its own terms. Shimizu's The Grudge I really like. I think it's quite subversive from within. But a lot of times, as with Nakata on The Ring too, was very constrained by what he could do. He kept on being told what he couldn't do. So it was very difficult for him actually to produce. I think the type of film that he envisaged that he wanted to do, which I think why that sort of relationship hasn't happened. I think it's about popularity. I think still people don't want to read subtitles, so it's producing something in English for the audience that doesn't want to read the subtitles. And I suppose they're not very expensive productions. I think none of the remakes of Japanese films besides The Ring have cost very much, and they've recouped on DVD. So I think it's about market. I think it's about, you know, a Western audience. But, you know, as I say in the book, the Ring took more money in Japan than Nakata's original did. So it's a really interesting thing, something being sold back and preferred to actually the original itself.
The Society recently did a members-only screening of Pink Cinema. You yourself have also wrote on Pink Cinema. What's your position on Pink Cinema and its aspects crossing over to the West?
I think Pink Cinema is the most quintessential Japanese genre, and I think it's really important historically. I think the early left-wing political directors of the independent Pink Cinema features, I think their work's really interesting, and I think it's all about framing and about a sort of Brechtian notion of distanciation that operates in those films rather than being that sort of sadistic towards women, which is how some of those films are viewed and are not available in the West. I mean, Violated Angels, which I did a review of, still banned, so you're still not allowed to see it. I think kind of when it goes mainstream, perhaps it becomes slightly more problematic. But, I mean, it's very difficult to access a lot of those films, and I kind of think you shouldn't talk about film until you've seen it. I think the problem with Pink Cinema is the exploitation of the actresses that may well have occurred in having to perform such sort of strenuous roles. But I don't know whether, I mean, certainly the recent torture porn genre, it tends to be traced back to Japanese Pink Cinema, and there's a whole S&M in Japanese Pink Cinema. But actually you can take it back to Herschel Gordon Lewis, and we talk about 2000 Maniacs, and so it doesn't necessarily come from Japan. I think that it's a misconception that yes, there is a distinct genre that deals with